This experiment has been done with brain imaging studies, and what we find is that a region of the brain here, the parietal lobe, now you heard about this region from both Anne and Amishi. So if you remember, Anne told you about a patient who ignored half of the space, half of visual space. That patient had damage to the parietal lobe. What this part of the brain does is it helps us move our attention. And if you have damage to this brain region, it's hard to move your attention to the opposite side of space. The amygdala doesn't just connect to the visual cortex, it also connects to the parietal lobe. And when we have an emotional stimulus that comes, we have less activation in this region, in the parietal lobe, which then makes it harder for us to move away, to look at something else when there's something emotional in front of us. So emotion captures attention, impairing our ability to process non-emotional events. And that brain regions that help us move our attention among events are less active when an emotional event is encountered.
Just ask me a question, how do you actually define emotion?
So in this case, something about the amygdala that's very interesting, and as I mentioned earlier, we can talk about how you define emotion for hours. But I want to answer this particular question because I would like to talk about this. I just want to be able to finish the rest of the talk. But the amygdala is not a region that seems to be necessary for your feeling. It actually seems to be a region that responds in the presence of something emotional that then sends a signal out to let the rest of the brain determine, is this important? So the feeling may come after that. So in this case, of course, you probably didn't have a strong emotional response in seeing those faces. But those faces are a signal that something's potentially important. You don't know yet whether it is important. But because it's potentially important, the brain should now pay more attention to that to determine if it really is important and something that is necessary to elicit a whole emotional response.
So for example, like if the amygdala is signaling something emotionally relevant, important event, does that necessarily imply that it is important to you, to the person who's experiencing, or can't one have emotion with relation to someone else that is completely other focused, like say altruism or compassion?
Sure, absolutely. So
so that may not be relevant to the survival or the well-being of the individual.
Yeah. No.
So it is not self-focused, or it's not self-directed.
It doesn't have to be self-focused. But you decide what's relevant to you. So if it is important to you, to be altruistic or compassionate, that still is relevant to you. Okay. So I want to now move on to emotion and memory, to talk about how emotion might influence our memories. And here I'm going to be talking about long-term declarative memory, the memories that we have for days or weeks or years. And before I get into what emotion does to memory, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of memory. So memory really has 3 stages. The first stage we call encoding.
So can you explain encoding?
Yes. This is when we first encounter information. So this is just the first time I see you, I'm encoding a memory of you. So this is just when we first encounter information. Once we've encountered information, we store the memory. This is a passive stage because we aren't doing anything. It is just in our minds and our brains, waiting for the next stage, which is retrieval. So emotion can influence. Yep. So retrieval is simply when we now recall the memories later. We want to bring them back to mind. So emotion can influence all 3 stages of memory independently. So I'm going to go through them one by one. I'm not going to say much about the first stage because essentially the first stage, what happens in encoding that influences memory, is the same thing that happens with attention. The more we pay attention to something, the more likely we are to remember it later. So I've already told you what emotion does to attention. What it does is it gives us enhanced processing for the highly emotional events and impaired processing for the other events that are around. So for instance, in this situation, you probably are hardly noticing the architecture of this building. So emotions' influence on encoding are the same as attention, which is it allows us a better ability to take in information that's central and emotionally important, and less of an ability to take in information that isn't as important. Storage. So storage to you and me seems like a very passive process. However, we know in the brain it's not so passive. There are changes that are happening in the brain over time that make memories become more or less stable. So a lot of the things that we encounter, we forget. But some of the things we don't. If you were to, for instance, bump your head and have a concussion, what might happen is you might forget some things that happened right beforehand. And this is because this storage process of memories was interrupted. So there's a period of time after you encounter something where the memory becomes set in your mind. And this is a storage process we call consolidation. Emotion influences this storage process. So in an experiment we did, we showed people pictures like this, sort of neutral scenes of people interacting. And later on, they were shown pictures like this again, and other pictures, ones they have seen before, ones they haven't seen before. And we asked them both immediately after they saw the pictures, and then also a week later, did you see these pictures before or did you not? And what we saw for the neutral pictures was a pattern that you might expect. Immediately, when we asked them, they remembered quite a few of the pictures. When we waited a week, however, they forgot quite a few. This happens all the time in memory. We forget things over time. We also included pictures that were highly emotional, like this one. Here, what we saw immediately, they also were very good at remembering which pictures they'd seen before. However, they didn't forget the pictures at the same rate. They seemed to hold on to them a little bit more strongly.
No.
We know this is because of the interaction of the amygdala here in red and this yellow region here called the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is a part of the brain that's very important for memory overall. If you have damage to this part of the brain, you won't remember almost anything. You wouldn't remember 5 minutes from now that we had this conversation, or a day. What we know happens when you encounter events here, they have to be events that are highly arousing, because this effect is completely due to the stress hormones that occur when you encounter an emotional event. The amygdala responds to these hormones, and it influences the storage processes in this region, the hippocampus. And this is why memories that are highly emotional are retained over time. So emotion enhances memory storage. Emotion also has an impact on this final stage of memory, which is when we recall it. So you probably remember where you were when you heard about the attacks of 9/11. Most people have fairly vivid memories of that day. So memory is not just coming up with information again, but when you come up with this information, it has a quality to it. It can have a sense of vividness, it can have a sense of detail. You can feel like you're recollecting it as if you're reliving the experience. Or it can just seem like something that happened before. It can seem somewhat familiar, but you don't really remember all the details. Memories for highly emotional events like this one are usually recollected with a strong sense of vividness, a sense of confidence that the memory is right and it has detail. So what's somewhat surprising about studies that have looked at memories for events like 9/11 is that even though individuals have this strong sense of vividness and confidence that their memories are right, they're not always so right in all the details. So let me give you an example of an experiment that was done. A day after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, students were brought into the laboratory and they were asked to write down what happened when they heard about the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and also to write down another event that had occurred that day or the day before. So for instance, if they'd gotten together with some friends to study for an exam, they might recall their study section. So the day after 9/11, they were asked to describe the events in detail for the terrorist attacks and the study session they had with their friends. A year later, they were brought back to the laboratory, and they were asked to write down their recollections of both the events of 9/11 and the study session. What they found was the memories for 9/11, although they were accurate in the details for what had happened that day in terms of the terrorist attack, they were no more accurate in the other details. So, for instance, where they were, who they heard it from, than memories for the study section. Both of the memories for details declined over time for both types of memories. So what differed between the memories for the study section and for 9/11 was that the subjects were highly confident that their details for the 9/11 memories were correct. It's very hard to convince somebody that they're wrong about what they recollect that day. But nevertheless, their details were not correct. For the other memories, they weren't confident in the details. It seemed like a distant memory, and they didn't have any confidence that they were correct about what they were saying. So this tells us that emotion increases our confidence in our memory accuracy, perhaps even more than it increases our memory accuracy. So if we want to think about why this is the case, we can look at the brain to give us some hints. So first, let's think about why this might be the case. So if you remember, when we see something highly emotional like this, what we do is we focus on it, so we encode this aspect of the memory very well. And because it's highly arousing, we store it better. So we have a very strong memory for the central important details that occurred that day. What we don't have is a strong memory for all these other details that occurred that day. We did an imaging study where we put people in the scanner and we asked them to recall their memories of 9/11. And we also asked them to recall memories of other life events that had occurred. So here's an example of a few of the memories. And these were all people, so New York University is fairly close to the World Trade Center, so these were all people that experienced it that day. And so these were some of the memories. So one person said, the explosion caused everyone in the area to automatically duck for cover. I saw some scaffolding that I could go under to avoid the falling debris. Another person said, I saw with my own eyes the towers burning in red flames, noises and cries of people. The other events that came up from their life were things like a birthday party or perhaps moving to New York for the very first time. When we compared memories for the recollections of 9/11 versus the other life events, we found greater activation in the amygdala and less activation in the parahippocampus, which Anne talked about yesterday. So let me go into this a little bit more.
Can you explain the significance of this?
Yes, I will. Yeah. So if you remember, the amygdala I talked about is a brain region that allows us to focus the attention and then stores that memory strongly. So this tells us when people are coming up with these memories, they're giving us very strong memories for these details. The parahippocampus, this is a region that Anne spoke about. It's right here in blue, that Anne spoke about in her talk. And if you remember, when people were looking at houses, they saw activation in the parahippocampus. This is a region, they call it a place area. So it actually is important in encoding a lot of details of the context of what's occurring. And the fact that they have less activation of this region suggests they have less memory for the details of the context when they're recalling these memories. So we're seeing a trade-off. So you actually are saying, I'm highly confident in the memories, in its details, but you're saying that because what you have is a very strong memory for a few central details and actually worse memory for all of the details of the context.
Yeah. So these are different localities in the brain.
Yes. So the place where we see the increase is here, and the place where we see the decrease is here. And this is a region we know that's important when you encounter potentially important events, that allows us to focus attention and store those details, those important details more strongly. This is a region that we know is important in encoding a lot of details of the scene. And so what we think is happening here is that your very strong memories for a few details is misleading you to think that you have a strong memory for all of the details when perhaps you actually don't. So what I've told you about emotion and memory is that emotion enhances the storage of events, so that the amygdala here actually influences the hippocampus to make sure that events are stored better over time, and that it increases confidence in memory accuracy more than accuracy. So we may not actually remember all the details of the emotional events, but sometimes we think we do. And you might wonder why this is the case. Why would we have a system of memory where we don't actually remember the details, but actually we think we do? And if we think about what memory does, memory is a guide from the past to help us act in the future. And when something's highly emotional, it's probably important that we remember that emotional event, but not so important that we remember the details. And the confidence you have in your memory helps you be sure about your memory. And so in an emotional situation, you may want to act quickly. You may not want to have to question whether your memory is correct, even if it's details, because probably if it's highly emotional, the details aren't what's so important.
So the implication here is that if the memory is not that of a strongly emotional kind of content, then there will be greater accuracy in remembering the details. Is that the implication?
So sometimes there's greater accuracy in the details for neutral events. Often, what you find is not much of a difference in the details for the neutral and emotional events, but people think the details are better for the emotional events.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The truth is, over time, we usually forget most of the details of neutral events anyways. So, all right, I want to now move on to the final part of my talk, which is to talk about the relationship between thoughts and emotion. So our thoughts play an important role in generating emotion. And here I'm getting back to what I hinted at the very beginning, this notion of appraisal. How we interpret an event or evaluate an event is important in the emotional response that we have. And I'm also going to suggest that our thoughts can both increase and decrease our brain's response to emotional events. But just to give you an example of the relationship between thoughts and emotion, as you can see, here we have two cats looking at the same dog. This cat, however, sees this as a mean, potentially threatening dog. This cat, however, sees this as a perhaps playful dog that could be its friend. Now, why these two cats have different interpretations of the dog, I don't know. It could be that this cat had a bad experience with the dog in the past and this cat didn't. Perhaps this cat was born being somewhat more fearful than this cat. Perhaps this cat has a meditative practice and this one does not. But the point I want to make here is that how we think about something can change the emotional response we have. And this is true both in our behavior and in our brain. So this gets back to the term appraisal that we talk about in emotion research. Anytime we encounter something, we have to say, is this relevant to me in this circumstance, or how am I going to make this relevant to me in this circumstance? And we have a choice here in what we do. And this just isn't how this doesn't just apply to our feelings, but also to our brain's response to emotional events. So this is one way that we show how thoughts can increase your brain's response to emotional events. So this is the type of experiment we do in the laboratory. We bring people in, we show them something neutral, like a blue square. And then we do something that's not very nice. We give them a little shock to the wrist. It doesn't hurt too much. It's a little electric shock, yes.
Shock test,
yeah.
test. Then experiment, that's shock.
I promise you it's not so bad.
So can you describe? Yeah.
The shock?
No. Can you just what happens afterwards?
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
What happens afterwards?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So what happens is, initially they see the blue square and they get a mild shock to the wrist, and when they get the mild shock, they get a little nervous. That's what these little dots here. That's sweating. And eventually, they just have to see the blue square, and they start to sweat a little bit. So they learn that the blue square predicts that they might get a shock. This is simple Pavlovian conditioning, much the way Pavlov described with a bell ringing and a dog getting food. You have this automatic body response to something fearful, which is a little bit of sweating, and now the blue square by itself, because it was paired with a shock, elicits that same emotional response. What's interesting is I don't have to actually give you a shock to have the blue square elicit an emotional response. I can just tell you that when you see a blue square, you might get a shock. I never actually have to give you a shock. And the emotional response that I see in the participants looks almost identical. So in this case, what you have is no direct experience. You have this symbolic conceptual knowledge of the relationship between the blue square and the shock. When I look at the brain in both of these circumstances, so here's what I see. Here's the amygdala here. And here's what I see when they're looking at the blue square that was paired with shock. Here's what I see. Here's the amygdala here. And here's what I see when I tell them that the blue square means you might get a shock. The brain looks almost identical in these two circumstances. And this tells you how our thoughts can generate emotional responses much in the same way actual aversive experience can. We can also diminish our emotional response. So doing something very similar. Now, again, in this experiment, we pair a blue square with a shock. We also have another stimulus here, a yellow square that never gets paired with shock. On some trials, I ask participants just to attend to their natural feelings when they see the blue square or they see the yellow square. On other trials, before they see the blue or the yellow square, I ask them now to regulate, to try to think about it differently, to change their emotional response. And the way we do this is before we do the experiment, we say, when you see the blue square, and I ask you now to regulate your emotional response, I want you to try to use that color to think of an image for you that's calming, an image from nature. So now, instead of, when you see the word regular, instead of thinking about the fact that you might get a shock, think about this image that you came up with that's calming to you. And this is what I see. So here what I've plotted, this is essentially a measure of your skin that tells me subtle differences in sweating. And here's the amount of sweating you have to the blue square that means you might get a shock, and the yellow square that means you won't get a shock. When I'm asking you now to just attend to your natural feelings, or try to regulate your emotional response. So here, I've plotted this sweating response. We call it the skin conductance response. That's what it stands for, SCR. And what you can see is they sweat more when they think they might get a shock, in both cases. But when they're attending to the emotional response, attending to the fact that they might get a shock, they sweat even more than when now they're trying to regulate their emotional response. So here, when they use this imagery strategy, they can decrease, at least their body's emotional response. When I look at the brain, so here I'm just looking at the amygdala, here, this response here. This is how the amygdala responds when I ask them to attend to their natural feelings, the fact that they might get a shock, and we see an increase in response here. When I ask them now to regulate their emotional response, we actually see a decrease in the amygdala response. However, the amygdala is not acting by itself. The amygdala is connected to a number of brain regions, as I told you. So what we saw was not just the amygdala decreasing its response, but a circuit of brain regions became involved. We saw greater activation in this region, what we call the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, when participants engaged in this regulation strategy. And this is the same region that Amishi talked about and Adele talked about as being important in executive control. So it's almost as if when they see these stimuli, and I'm asking them now to think about it differently, they're having to use these executive processes to help reinterpret the stimulus. This region shows connections to another region here, which we call the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. This is a region that we know has strong connections with the amygdala and is capable of actually inhibiting responses in the amygdala in a number of different paradigms. And these two regions are connected to each other. And we think both of these regions work in conjunction now with diminishing the amygdala response, and in this case, at least the body's expression of the emotional response. So just to sum up this last part, I've suggested to you that our thoughts play an important role in generating emotion. How we appraise a situation or interpret a situation determines our emotional response. and that our thoughts can increase or decrease the brain's response to emotional events. So how we interpret the significance of events can increase or decrease the amygdala's response. And through the interactions with the prefrontal cortex, this gives us a pathway for thoughts to influence the amygdala. And I have one question to finish up that we can talk about in the discussion. So I wanted to ask you, do you think analytic meditation has effects similar to emotion regulation?
Definitely, yeah.
And if...
Of course, depends on what we mean by meditation, the word meditation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm leaving that up to you.
For example, if you meditate on an object of desire and cultivate that familiarity, it will increase your attachment.
Which is, a
form
of emotion regulation, perhaps not what you...
And if you focus, single-pointedly on an object of hatred, then it could enhance your hatred.
Mm-hmm. Well, emotion regulation, as I showed you, can both increase and decrease fear. How we choose to use it is really up to us. And then the question becomes, and this is not something we've looked at, whether either emotion regulation or analytic meditation might influence emotion's impact on attention, memory, and the choices we make. But I don't know if you have any insights into how that might occur.
So generally speaking, we can, even within the emotions, you can make a distinction between those that are somehow grounded in reason, some kind of rationale, mm-hmm. and some that are much more reactive.
But I also think that our the way that we interpret events can actually, ahead of time, when we come to a situation, will change our immediate reaction. So I think when we say that, I don't think it's the case that the reason is only dealing with things after the fact. I think how we approach a situation can, ahead of time.
That's true. That's very true.
All right, and finally, I just want to thank you again for this dialogue today.
Thank you, Liz. I think it might be helpful to sort of clarify if, for the following discussion, if both sides of the discussion are understanding the same thing in emotion. Maybe that would be a little bracket that we can open before we make a break. So just that afterwards in the discussion we really talk about the same thing. Mm-hmm. So would some of you, maybe Alan, would you want to...
I would love for Liz to begin, because a very important point here is that in Tibetan, as we've learned years ago, with all of the sophistication and detail of terms for very specific mental processes, as Rupert filled it in the other day, but there's a lot more detail that he didn't have time to go into. For all the detail that is there is no single term in either modern Tibetan or the classic Tibetan that is a
we
very...
have in the modern.
With the Tibetan.
Modern Tibetan we have.
And what is that?
Not in the classical, Nyongso.
Nyongso. Yeah. And so, but in the classic, in the classic presentation, there is no term that corresponds closely to emotion. So I think if we're going to initiate such a discussion, it would really be good if you could fill us in on it. And if I could just give one suggestion of something you might touch on is compassion is as obviously very central to the whole Buddhist endeavor. Some people believe that compassion is an emotion. Some would say it's not an emotion, it is actually a more of a cognitive state, one of aspiration and yearning, which is conjoined with emotion. But if you could just simply clarify for all of us here what you mean by emotion, and what would be the demarcations of what is and isn't.
Emotion, even in Sanskrit, I don't think there is a term for emotion.
Modern they use bhavana, but
Microphone, please.
I'll say that just for the record, and that is in the classical Sanskrit, there is no corresponding term, but they take from the classical, and in the more modern usage of classical, then bhavana.
Bhavana.
I mean, there are words.
Maybe I could give a sort of a brief answer, and then which is not going to be satisfactory, I don't think. I think it's interesting to me that there is no single term for emotion, because I think in the way that we think about emotion in Western science, it's almost a hindrance to have a single term for emotion, because it really isn't one thing. And so even today, in the talk I gave, the different effects I talked about, different components of what I call emotion underlie those effects. So when I talked about emotion enhancing the storage, I know that's completely due to the physiological arousal response that you get, which is a component of emotion. When I talked about attention, the effects on attention, there it's really a signaling of something potentially important that isn't related to physiological arousal. So emotion theorists have had quite a difficult time coming up with even defining what emotion is, and it's never one thing. It's many, many things. And so we call the main theories of emotion component models of emotion, because we break emotion down into its component. If we had to think of one thing that holds all of these things together, is that I would say it's something about signaling what's important to us, what's relevant to us. And so to me, the category of emotion somehow has something to do with signaling what's relevant or what's important. But there's a number of different ways that it's expressed, a number of different ways that it's done, and it's quite confusing to try to come up with all the different details of the things that comprise emotion. And I think it's been difficult for Western science because people don't mean the same thing when they talk about it often. And the fact that we have one word to describe so many things kind of lets us talk past each other at times.
Richie, you want to make a...
Well, I wanted to actually ask the Buddhist scholars in some systems of the Abhidharma, at least as I understand it, for each there is one of the mental factors concerns positive, negative, or neutral, and that is regarded as an omnipresent mental factor.
Vedana, feeling, yeah.
Feeling.
It's translated as feeling.
And so...
No. So you're talking about it positive, negative in the sense of how it is felt, rather than ethically, not ethically, from an ethical point of view, positive, negative, but rather from the point of view of joyful, pleasant, unpleasant. That's what you meant. Okay,
yes.
Risha.
Yes, and so if that is the case, what is the Buddhist understanding of what that positive and negative is actually referring to? Is it some affective coloring or tone to the mental process, or is it some other quality which has not yet been fully described here?
저는 소리도 들고
또 소리도 So of course he's one of saying that this is his own take on this. When we bring up concepts like feeling in the Buddhist context, one needs to understand this because it's an activity. So one needs to understand it in terms of an agent that experiences it, or the instrument by which you experience it, and then the object of that experience, and what is being experienced, in the manner in which it is being experienced. So when we talk about pleasant and unpleasant and neutral feeling, positive, negative, and neutral feeling, then it is the object of the feeling, what is being felt. So then there is the subject feeling aspect of the feeling, and that is this receptivity to what kind of feeling that might be encountered. So when we say the omnipresent mental factors, feeling in that context, it is the subjective component part of that feeling, which is this receptivity to whatever feeling may it encounter, whatever experience it may encounter. So His Holiness' own feeling is that when we talk about Vedana or feeling in the context of the five omnipresent mental factors that are present in So it is this subjective
얘는
component.
그 딱 배웠거든요. 소리지도 차와 샤쇼로.
So of course, when it experiences whatever feeling tone it experiences, it takes that shape or it takes that form. But conceptually, still you can make a distinction between a subjective aspect and the objective aspect of the actual experience.
자질 내성 시도자네. 자와도 되는 시보보, 시보보 되는 자와. 도도를 샤하면.
So, for example, when we conceptualize an act, so there is an object of action, there is the actual act itself, and then there is the agent. So conceptually, one needs to make a distinction, but in actual fact, it may be the one and the same thing sometimes.
So with this, I would like to make a break, a tea break, and then we gather again in 15 minutes. Thank you.